I was once a soldier. The years of service became a series of sleepless nights and constant tension. The loss of comrades and the heavy decisions I'd been forced to make still haunt my dreams. When I returned home, I realized I no longer wanted to hear commanding shouts or explosions. I needed a quiet life. That's how I ended up in a small town in West Virginia. Quiet streets, old houses, and a surrounding forest seemed at first like the perfect place to forget about the war. I opened an auto repair shop. Talking to machines was easier than talking to people. Parts can be replaced, but one can't simply fix the wounds of war. The clatter of tools helped me switch off, even though memories of the past still surfaced from time to time. My wife, Emily, became my true support. Without a word, she accepted my gloomy moods and comforted me when nightmares jolted me awake in the night. With her, I felt I still had a reason to live. We tried to build a quiet life, but the habit of being alert to every sound lingered. Soon, I noticed that this seemingly peaceful town was steeped in dark rumors. Locals whispered about mysterious sounds in the night and about missing pets. It all seemed like ordinary rural ghost stories. Yet it was obvious that people would purse their lips and avert their eyes whenever the forest trails were mentioned. At night, I often noticed that the shadows deep in the woods seemed too dark. Sometimes I felt as if someone were watching from the thicket. In the army, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and they hinted that things here were not as simple as they appeared. I didn't know what was lurking among the trees, but I understood that one day I'd have to get to the bottom of it. One day, while I was in my workshop repairing a freshly delivered car and exchanging a few words with Tom, the mailman who liked to stop by and chat, the door opened with the tinkling of the bell. A man in a long coat entered, even though the weather was warm. His pale face with sharp cheekbones immediately caught my attention. Yet even stranger was his gaze. He looked at me as if he already knew everything about me and was now merely checking to see if I lived up to his expectations. I put down the key and wiped my hands on a rag, trying to remain calm, though inside I felt my military instincts flare up. I noticed details. There were no visible signs of a weapon, yet his coat could easily hide something. The stranger greeted me in a quiet but firm voice, addressing me by my last name, pausing as if waiting for a reaction. There was something unsettling about that. Hardly anyone here knew my surname, and he addressed me like an old acquaintance. "I suppose you don't know who I am," he said, then sat on a stool by the workbench. "But I know much about you and your service. I have a proposal that might interest you." I raised an eyebrow, preparing for another attempt at selling miracle cures or insurance. However, the stranger's tone was far more serious. He pulled a small folder from his pocket and handed it to me. The cover bore some kind of government seal. Opening the folder, I saw photographs of mutilated animal carcasses, black and white snapshots of a dark silhouette in the forest, and a series of reports with annotations. All the materials were signed with one word: Dogman. "You've probably heard the local legends," he continued. "We call this creature Dogman, half man, half beast, or rather, a half being, depending on how you look at it. By the rumors, it roams the surrounding woods, killing livestock and pets. There are even reports that people have disappeared, though nothing official has ever been confirmed." I remembered the strange tales I'd heard in the army about mysterious entities. Back then, I dismissed them as mere ghost stories to ease the tension. But now before me lay tangible evidence, photographs, reports, and forensic documents with notes about an unknown predator. My rational mind still doubted, but deep inside, a sense of unease stirred. "And what do you want from me?" I asked, closing the folder. I need someone who isn't afraid of legends and can act where others hesitate, the stranger replied. Your experience is unique. My organization is prepared to pay handsomely if you can help track down and, if possible, eliminate Dogman. It sounded like a challenge. I'd tried to leave behind my life on the battlefield and never imagined I'd find myself hunting again. Yet inside me, memories flared of the times when my decisions could save comrades' lives. A strange mix of fear and excitement overtook me. I'll send you more details, said the stranger as he rose from the stool. Think it over. If you decide to accept, call the number on this card. He left behind his business card and exited, quietly shutting the door behind him. I listened to the distant hum of the highway and felt my long, dormant instincts stir. That night I couldn't sleep. The photographs from the folder replayed before my eyes. Blood, animal carcasses, dark silhouettes in the forest. One might think I had seen horrors far worse in the war. But the thought of this mysterious beast reminded me that reality isn't simple, and a prick of conscience wouldn't let me forget. Protecting people had always been my duty, and my quiet life no longer allowed for heroic deeds. In the morning, I fumbled for the business card in my pocket and muttered that it was a crazy idea. Yet the strange rumors around town persisted. I heard conversations about missing pets and eerie sounds from deep within the forest. I felt that something inside me had already made a choice. Soon I dialed the number on the card. My heart pounded as if I were once again standing before a commander's order. I was asked to come to the outskirts of town to an old hangar where decommissioned vehicles were once stored. There, I saw the stranger again, this time introducing himself as Mr. Griffith. He handed me detailed materials, reports of attacks, coordinates of forest trails, and made it clear that the authorities were officially turning a blind eye to the problem. Back home, I felt the combat mode kick in. I checked the windows and doors, retrieved the old hunting rifle my father-in-law had given me, and found some of my military gear tucked away in a far corner of the closet. Not that I was planning to charge into the woods immediately, but suddenly the world around me turned into a zone of heightened danger. Emily noticed the change in me. When I sat at the kitchen table, spreading out a map of the area and marking the points where attacks had occurred, she came over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I won't try to talk you out of this," she said quietly, "but I'm scared of losing you. With people, at least you know what to expect. But here..." "I understand," I replied, trying to meet her gaze. "But if Dogman exists and keeps killing, who will stop it? I can't live by pretending nothing is happening." In those words, the old military sense of duty shone through, as if I still clung to the oath I had once taken. Emily nodded in understanding and no longer tried to dissuade me. I decided to first learn more about the forest itself and its legends. At the local bar, which reeked of wood smoke and beer, I tracked down an old hunter named Franklin. His face was carved with wrinkles, and his eyes burned with intensity as soon as I mentioned the Beast Man. "I've heard it, son," he began, sipping his beer. "Sometimes at night you can hear a beast howling, not exactly like a wolf, but the voice is too strange. The footsteps are heavy, like a bear's, and the tracks, you can't tell if they belong to a wolf or a man. It's something in between. For 10 years now, I've avoided some of those trails." Franklin's words filled me with dread. They confirmed that the town's rumors were not baseless. He pointed out on a map the locations where brutally torn-up animals had been found and recounted how a hunter had disappeared last fall. No one directly claimed Dogman was involved, but the mere mention of the name made the bar's patrons squint and lower their eyes. Back at my workshop, I discovered a metal box containing military gear left over from the past. Inside were a night vision device, a long-range radio, and a survival kit. I meticulously checked everything. The tools were still in good condition. One evening, while I was pulling a client's car into the parking lot, a rustling near the fence caught my attention, as if something large had brushed against the trash bins. I saw only the glint of a stray cat's eyes in the darkness, yet my heart raced and my palms grew sweaty. My subconscious reminded me that I was once again on high alert. For several days, I planned a nocturnal outing, selecting a spot where deeply scratched trees and anomalous tracks were frequently found. Finally, I decided to set up an ambush in a clearing in the forest, a place where hunters often discovered traces of an unusually large beast. That night, I drove my pickup to the northern edge of the woods. I loaded everything I might need into the bed: my rifle with a night scope, extra ammunition, a knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a jerry can of gasoline. This was what Mr. Griffith had instructed. If it came to taking down the monster, I was to destroy its body, so that no one could later start asking questions or investigate something that clearly defied the normal fauna. The forest greeted me with a thick darkness and a silence that wasn't peaceful, but rather as if it were staring into me from within. Every snap of a twig underfoot reminded me of covert military maneuvers, where every unnecessary noise could mean the difference between life and death. At the edge of the clearing, I quietly laid a deer carcass on the ground, a decoy to lure in a large predator. The night air was heavy with moisture, and the trees that encircled the clearing looked like a tall, dark wall. Settling behind a boulder, I waited, feeling the tension tighten my muscles. The hours dragged, as if time itself were deliberately stretching, making me increasingly uncomfortable. The moon rose above the treetops, casting patches of light on the grass and rotting leaves. Then I heard the soft crunch of twigs. Pressing the butt of my rifle against my shoulder, I scanned the clearing through the scope. Approaching the carcass was a creature with a wolf-like snout and an agape mouth from which long fangs gleamed. Yet its body was unnaturally elongated, its legs peculiarly muscular, and its movements almost human in their smoothness. A wave of sickening terror ran down my spine. My rational mind refused to believe what I saw. The beast sniffed the carcass, rummaged through its entrails, and in that moment I pulled the trigger. A flash pierced the darkness, and the shot's roar seemed to echo for miles. Dogman howled, recoiling and dropping a chunk of flesh. In my night scope, I saw the creature raise its head, its eyes burning with an eerie light, and its mouth twisted in a furious snarl. In an instant it jerked toward me and moved onto all fours as if preparing to lunge. I racked the bolt while never taking my eyes off it. In the forest, a deathly silence reigned, with only the echo of the shot still trembling among the trees. Dogman leapt, a swift burst rather than a graceful jump, attempting to flank me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught its movement and managed to roll behind a boulder, firing a second shot. The bullet grazed its front right leg, making it howl and dart aside. A roar escaped its jaws, a sound not entirely animalistic, with hints of something almost human. My heart pounded as if I were once again in a firefight rather than facing a supernatural horror. I knew that the key was not to let the creature come too close. Dogman had long fangs and claws that could tear me apart in seconds. Noticing blood on its right front leg, I realized the wound was serious, but a wounded predator is always more dangerous. The beast began to circle the clearing, sometimes moving on 2 legs, sometimes on 4, as if seeking its weak spot. Then, suddenly, it dashed forward and I barely managed to raise my rifle and fire again. The bullet struck its side and the creature staggered, crying out in pain. Yet instead of fleeing, it made a circular motion as if trying to hide in the dense shadows of the trees. Not willing to let it escape, I jumped out from behind the boulder and sprinted after it, occasionally checking to see if any of my gear had fallen. The trail of blood glowed faintly in the moonlight, helping me maintain my direction. But inside, I felt a growing terror. What if Dogman now set an ambush for me? Every rustle made me grip the rifle even tighter. Suddenly, from the darkness came a painful groan mixed with intermittent growls. I crept between tree trunks, careful not to step on brittle twigs. Behind a dense thicket, I found the wounded creature. It lay on the ground, gasping painfully, clutching its mangled leg to its chest. It seemed as though fear mingled with rage flickered in its eyes. I raised my rifle, careful not to get too close. The beast struggled, bared its fangs, and then I fired a final, decisive shot. The deafening report echoed so powerfully that my ears rang and Dogman shuddered before collapsing to the ground, letting out a gurgled breath that quickly died away. My heart pounded and sweat blurred my vision. Up close, I saw the hideous face, a grotesque fusion of a bestial snout and nearly human features. I shuddered, yet I knew I had to destroy the carcass. Deep down, I feared that this abomination might somehow be resurrected. Shivering, I dragged the body back to the clearing. I then found a shovel and dug a shallow pit so that the flames wouldn't spread to the dry grass, and doused the carcass with gasoline. The flames roared to life, devouring the darkness, and the air filled with the unbearable stench of burning fur. As I watched the creature reduced to charred fragments, I felt both relief and a grim terror. In this world, there are things man should never see. The next morning, Meister Griffith called and arranged another meeting at the same old hangar. When I arrived, he listened to my account, calmly looked over the photographs I had managed to take before I burned the body, and handed me a hefty wad of money. "You did a good job," he said flatly. "Here's your share." "I hope that's the end of it," I muttered as I pocketed the cash. I'd hate for these nightmares to come back. Mr. Griffith merely shrugged, and it was clear. If new cases arise, he'd call on me again. I longed to return to a peaceful life with Emily, yet I already felt that tranquility might be only a brief respite. For several weeks, life went on as usual. I worked on cars. Emily spent time with her friends and at the library. I tried not to dwell on Dogman, but soon rumors began circulating again in town. This time, people described the nocturnal cries differently, as if someone were calling from the darkness with a cold, soul-chilling voice. At first I didn't pay much attention, but the unease grew. One evening Tom came running to my shop, his face pale with fear. He recounted that he'd seen something tall and gaunt in the woods, with a head that resembled a horned skull. "I can't forget it," he mumbled. It was so chilling, as if a frost had come in midsummer, and its gaze was unreal. I recalled legends of the Wendigo, a creature cursed with eternal hunger, typically encountered in northern forests. It could instill a bone-deep terror and possessed inhuman strength. Now I began to seriously wonder if this ancient evil had emerged in our midst. My mind immediately turned to Mr. Griffith. The organization he represented surely knew about such beings, yet I had never received any concrete explanation from him. Rumors spread, but there were neither direct proofs nor confirmed attacks, aside from the missing animals, until one evening that shattered my life. That day, I closed the shop later than usual, and when I got home, Emily was waiting with dinner. The sun was setting, and scarlet clouds were spreading across the sky. Our house was on the outskirts near the forest when suddenly I heard a gut-wrenching scream from outside. I grabbed my rifle. Emily peered out from the kitchen. Our eyes met in alarm, and then I felt a sharp chill, as if the temperature had suddenly plummeted. A figure emerged from behind the trees, tall, skeletal, with antlers crowning its head. The contours of the antlers shimmered as if reflecting an eerie light, and in its eye sockets, a ghostly flame danced. Like a scene from a nightmare, the creature leaped at our shattered window and burst into the house. I shouted at Emily to get to the bedroom while raising my weapon. But the beast moved with an inhuman speed. I only managed to feel the impact as it struck me, throwing me against the wall. The windows rattled from the force, and an icy veil hung in the air. A scream from the kitchen reached me, and I was stricken with horror. The Wendigo had reached Emily before I could rise. Desperately trying to aim, I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the door frame, missing its mark. The creature, as if gliding through the air, its slender limbs still carrying monstrous strength, countered every move of mine with swift retaliation. On my second attempt to fire, I hurriedly squeezed the trigger and was struck again by the creature's attack, so that sparks flew from my eyes. I hit my head hard against the wall and lost consciousness for a moment. When I came to, I was dizzy and bleeding from cuts on my head. Everything blurred before my eyes, but I made out the Wendigo standing over Emily. It bent over her as if sniffing her, then abruptly straightened and fixed its gaze on me. Its eyes, or what served as eyes, flared with a cold light. The monster didn't take her body away. Instead, it seemed to demonstrate its strength and cruelty before leaping out through the shattered window. I crawled over to Emily. She wasn't breathing. A knot formed in my throat. The world had shrunk to the single point of her still form. I couldn't feel a pulse, no matter how desperately I tried to stop the bleeding. The sheriff and ambulance arrived quickly. Terrified neighbors had heard the screams and gunshots. But what could they possibly see? Shattered windows, blood, Emily's body. No one would believe my explanation. It sounded like madness. Doctors had to tend to my wounds and administer a sedative, while a true pain constricted my chest like an iron band. A week passed. The town helped with the funeral, yet no one knew how to console me. My account of a horned monster filled them with horror and incomprehension. I hardly spoke to anyone, and my home became a tomb of memories. All I wanted was for that beast to return so I could kill it. Then Mr. Griffith visited me again. After inspecting the ravaged living room and shaking his head, he expressed his condolences and supposed that the creature had been the Wendigo, a primordial being that rarely revealed itself until it had marked its next victim. I murmured that it had taken Emily from me and asked if he had known of its existence and why he hadn't warned me. Shrugging indifferently, Griffith explained that there hadn't been any concrete data, as such beings appeared suddenly and the authorities refused to deal with them. However, he pointed out that I had handled dogmen and possessed the necessary skills. If I wanted to track down the Wendigo, he added, he would help me with the information. I knew then that I had no choice. Vengeance for Emily became the sole purpose of my life. I quit the auto shop, abandoned the house, and devoted my entire being to one goal, putting an end to that monster. The next day, I closed the shop for good, gathered my weapons and gear, loaded everything into my pickup, and left behind the town that now only reminded me of loss. Mr. Griffith handed me a new folder with reports detailing ritualistic marks left by the Wendigo on trees and notes about sudden local temperature drops. The roads heading northwest wound through dense forests and mountain ranges. The information Meister Griffith provided mentioned several cases of missing people and livestock in that region. I marked every suspicious location on a map, planning to comb through them one by one. Sometimes at gas stations or roadside diners, I overheard people recounting tales of a horned monster in the woods. Some laughed it off. Others shook their heads sympathetically while recounting the disappearance of dogs and the sudden icy chill that befell travelers. I listened intently, gathering every scrap of truth. At night, I slept either in cheap motels or directly in my truck. I dreamed of the moment when the Wendigo took Emily from me, waking up with a sharp pain in my chest, instinctively reaching for the knife tucked under my pillow. Finally, Griffith sent word that his sources had picked up the Wendigo near a mountain range along the border with Ohio. I didn't hesitate. I changed course and drove almost 24 hours before reaching the foot of the mountains. There I set up camp, prepared my weapons, and recalled all the skills that had once kept me alive. The next morning I set off along old hunting trails. An eerie silence prevailed, so deep that even the birds ceased their singing. Suddenly, a sharp, cold wind rose, a familiar sign of something otherworldly nearby. The thermal imager displayed strange flashes that appeared and disappeared as if something were moving just a few steps away. I trudged deeper into the pine forest, listening for any sound. In the distance came a long, wailing moan that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It felt as though even the sky above had darkened. I gripped my rifle tighter and headed in the direction of the sound. The forest looked like a set from a horror movie. Towering black trunks, thick moss carpeting the ground in a cold twilight that defied the time of day. With every step, I felt the air grow thin, as if the very space were rejecting my presence. The moaning came again, this time closer, and the temperature around me seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I switched on the thermal imager, but the image only flickered and jumped, as if the device itself had gone mad. And then I saw it. The Wendigo emerged from behind an ancient fir as if it had materialized out of nowhere. Tall, gaunt, with skeletal limbs and sprawling antlers that resembled those of a deer, yet twisted in such a way that a sinister pattern could be seen in them. Its dead eyes stared directly at me, and a damp mist oozed from the hollows of its skull. The creature let out a soul-freezing howl, and a wave of paralyzing terror swept through me. For a split second, I nearly dropped my rifle. The sensation was overwhelming. My hands trembled, but I remembered why I was here. For Emily. I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, stunning the Wendigo, yet it swiftly moved aside, and the bullet struck a tree, tearing chunks of bark from its trunk. The creature lunged at me, and I barely managed to dive to the side, feeling a cold gust brush across my face. My forehead broke out in a cold sweat. The creature, now howling, rushed past me and swiped its clawed hand at my rifle, cracking the stock and sending the weapon several feet away. I staggered, scrambling to retrieve it, grasping whatever remnants of the barrel I could find. The beast turned its horned head toward me, and in that moment I saw its menacing eyes up close. Dark voids with a glimmer of something icy within. I couldn't tell whether it was leaping or charging. All became one blur of motion. I managed to toss a flashlight in its path to disrupt its momentum. The Wendigo recoiled, and without losing a second, I fired once more from what remained of my rifle. The bullet struck its shoulder, causing the creature to roar as if it were choking on the death of several generations. I felt a piercing chill course through me, and I saw blood, dark, thick, staining its pale, ribbed chest. It meant I could wound it. I dashed forward, knowing that I couldn't let this opportunity slip. I had to finish the monster while it was injured. But the Wendigo, staggering, stepped toward me, pressing its bony hand to its wound. It was as if its fury only grew, determined to tear me apart. Gathering every ounce of will, I rammed the butt of my rifle against my shoulder as best I could and fired another shot. This time, the Wendigo recoiled, and its agonized howl tore through the air. The creature clutched its side, and from it, a greater gush of dark, foul liquid erupted. It staggered, collapsing to its knees and lowering its horned head. I inched closer, though fear still choked me. Dark veins began to spread across the Wendigo's body. Up close, it looked like decaying flesh, a putrescence that had no place in our world. It raised its head and fixed me with a look that nearly made me close my eyes. Within that gaze, there was an endless hunger and ancient malice, as though it cursed the very fact of my existence. "For Emily," I whispered, and pressing my rifle to my shoulder, fired the final shot into its chest. The resounding blast rang out among the pines, and the Wendigo toppled onto its back. In an instant, the icy wind died, as if, with the creature's death, that otherworldly chill had also vanished. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands trembling. An oppressive silence reigned around me. Somewhere overhead, the treetops rustled as a gust of wind passed by. Slowly, I knelt by the monster's mutilated horned skull. Up close, it looked as though nature itself had spat out its most horrifying grimace. With shaking fingers, I retrieved a lighter from my pocket and, without further thought, doused the Wendigo's body with the remaining gasoline from a small flask I'd stashed in my pack, just in case. Flames burst forth and I recoiled, overwhelmed by the stench of burning fur and charred flesh. No one should ever find the remains of this creature and try to resurrect its power with occult knowledge or anything else. When the fire died down, all that remained of the Wendigo were charred bones and ash, which I covered with earth and debris. Inside me, an emptiness reigned, yet along with it, a piercing pain. I had done what I had lived for, avenged Emily, but no relief came. My life now seemed barren and gray. I recalled how I had been a soldier, how I had fought on distant lands, and then I realized my war had shifted into a different kind, where the enemies were not men, but something far older and more terrifying. Perhaps there are more such creatures than we can imagine. Sitting in my pickup, I looked at a photograph of Emily I kept in my pocket. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I had avenged her. It wouldn't bring her back, but at least it would save others from falling prey to claws and fangs that did not belong to this world. That marked the end of my hunt for the Wendigo. Though inside I was left with an abyss of pain, I knew that somewhere far away, other forces like that monster lurked. Perhaps Mr. Griffith would find me again if his organization ever encountered another unworldly terror. But by then, nothing would shock me anymore. I returned home not as a victor, but as a man who had lost everything yet had done what no one else could. I wasn't sure if I could ever find peace after all I had been through. The only certainty was that I was no longer a mere bystander. If darkness ever arose again, I would fight. Because the most frightening thing that can happen to you after war is to realize that the war, in truth, never ended. Story 2. My heart constricted painfully as Kyle and I turned onto the narrow road leading to my family's old estate. The howling wind outside the car and the swaying shadows cast by the tall pines transported me back to my childhood, when I feared every creak of wood in the night. As dusk slowly deepened around us, it felt as if the forest was embracing us with its ancient secrets. The estate was located on a remote plot in northern Washington state, where dark woods and damp ravines stretched for miles. From an old, stone-paved path, the facade of a wooden cottage could be seen, a low building with a wide porch, its walls overtaken by moss under the relentless assault of time. From a distance, it almost seemed that nature itself was trying to reclaim it. Kyle, my boyfriend, had grown up in a big city and had never been to such an isolated place. Yet since childhood, he had been drawn to mysticism and legends. He loved to tell stories about ghosts, werewolves, and other creatures. Sometimes I thought that inside him lived a child, eager to encounter what usually exists only in the imagination. And yet, he remained a rational and insightful man. We had come here to celebrate my graduation, to decide what to do next, and to spend a few days in a place where I had once been happy. My parents often warned me about a nearby cave that was strictly off-limits. But as a child, forbidden places only fueled my curiosity. And of course, I had managed to sneak a peek into that gloomy crevice a couple of times. Now we were back here, surrounded by ancient trees and shadows of the past, trying to relax and reset. I pulled the last bag out of the trunk and we entered the house, where we were greeted by the heavy smell of dust and abandonment. In the light of a lamp, you could see phantasmal shadows dancing in the corners. A cursed tremor shivered in my chest, a premonition that this trip might become unforgettable. Though not necessarily in a pleasant way. Night fell quickly, the darkness nearly absolute. Sitting by the fireplace, Kyle and I exchanged jokes, trying to ward off the tension. Outside, the wind rocked the pine branches, sending eerie creaks throughout the house. It seemed as though the silence itself exhaled something ancient and hungry. Closer to midnight, the first eerie sounds reached our ears. Strange, drawn-out howls, as if several voices had merged into one, anguished and melancholy. I felt goosebumps crawl along my spine and a surge of apprehension in my chest. Kyle immediately tensed, set his coffee cup down on the table, and moved to the window. I watched him intently scanning the darkness, trying to catch any movement. I suggested that it could be a pack of wolves, hoping that was the case. Kyle raised his eyebrows and questioned the idea, wondering if it was possible. However, he pointed out that there weren't many wolves in the area and that they wouldn't typically approach people on their own. He then speculated that it might be something else and reminded me of how he used to talk about myths and mysterious creatures. I sighed and told him to stop, though my voice trembled slightly. I then suggested that we check everything out in the daylight the next day, emphasizing that in the dark, we couldn't really see anything. He agreed, and we tried to fall asleep. Yet intrusive thoughts of the cave, where, as a child, I was forbidden to go, kept creeping into my mind. Perhaps there was still something terrifying and unknown hidden inside. In the morning, succumbing to curiosity, we decided not to limit ourselves to exploring the yard, but to head straight for the cave. Kyle mentioned that if the sounds continued, we should find their source before we fully immersed ourselves in this vacation vibe. Although a vague unease overwhelmed me, I agreed. My heart, too, was torn by curiosity. What was really happening in this forest? The trail led deep into the woods, through a dense growth of tall grass and ferns. I remembered running along this same road as a child, feeling the springy moss under my feet and listening to the rustle of leaves overhead. Now the forest seemed alien, menacing, and cold. The shadows of the trees wove strange patterns on the ground, and every rustle sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, we reached the cave, a stone opening concealed by thick underbrush. The entrance was small. An adult would have to stoop to enter. My heart clenched at the memories. the inner galleries and the slippery walls over which droplets of water streamed. We cautiously peered inside. Once enveloped in darkness, I was hit by a sharp smell of dampness mixed with something else, a sort of animal musk. We hadn't ventured far, our paths lit by flashlights, when suddenly Kyle stopped and raised his hand in warning. "Something's moving over there," he whispered. I froze and listened. Then we saw it. A small creature in the corner pressed against the stones. It bared its teeth and emitted a barely audible growl, as if injured or frightened. At first, it seemed like a wolf pup. But in the beam of our flashlight, strange features became visible. Unusually long forelimbs and a somewhat human posture, as if it were trying to rise almost onto its hind legs. Its eyes glowed like a pair of burning coals. My hands began to tremble and my heart pounded wildly. Yet soon, fear gave way to compassion. This was just a child, a young one, albeit an unusual one. Kyle, who was no stranger to legends, whispered, "Quiet, it might be some kind of dogman. You know, those myths about humanoid dogs." "Dogman?" I mumbled. "I've only heard those tales in passing. But it seems like it, doesn't it? Or am I going crazy?" Apparently, yes. We exchanged anxious glances. The creature looked at us as if unsure whether to fear us or hope for help. I took a cautious step forward and motioned for Kyle to back me up. We decided to take the puppy outside and examine it for injuries. The creature didn't resist as we wrapped it in a jacket and carefully carried it out of the cave. It appeared too weak to put up any fight. Only a quiet, stifled whimper testified to its fear and pain. That very evening we heard them, the strong, prolonged howls that seemed to be drawing nearer. It was well past midnight, and I couldn't sleep as I noticed our acquisition behaving restlessly. Whimpering, occasionally whining as it stared out the window, clearly longing for its kin. Stepping out onto the porch, we cautiously peered into the dancing shadows of the night. Suddenly, far off among the pine trunks, I discerned moving silhouettes. There were several of them, all of impressive size. Moments later, we realized these were dogmen, adult specimens, moving on all fours yet capable of rearing up on their hind legs. Their eyes glimmered in the darkness, and as they moved, a low growl could be heard. My heart pounded with the realization that what we had dismissed as mere myth was now all too real. We observed that some of these creatures lingered closer to the caves, as if guarding their territory, while another group howled farther off, deep within the forest. According to Kyle's observation, the two groups differed not only in appearance but also in their manner of movement and the sounds they produced. It seemed they were from different tribes, divided by territory and ancient animosities. That night, the howling and growling grew louder, eventually swelling into a veritable war cry that shattered the forest silence. Kyle and I huddled by the windows, watching as monstrous figures merged with the shadows along the tree line, flickering in the moonlight. It was a true battle. Blows, furious howls, piercing screams. It seemed as though the entire forest trembled with the violence of it all. Clutching my chest, I felt a primitive terror. Our little dogman pup, inside the house, whimpered and stretched toward the window, clearly desperate to get out to its own. But what could we do? Intervene in this wild war? We were merely humans, accidental witnesses to a bloody conflict. Sitting on the floor next to the pup, I felt time slow down. Outside, the wailing cries continued, sometimes fading, sometimes swelling again. I patted the little one on the head. It was agitated, and it seemed understood that something important was happening outside. The dogmen were at war with each other, and their battle was genuine. with mortal risks, fury, and bloodshed. Kyle sat down beside me. He had been mulling over some plan all this time, but hesitated to voice it. "I don't think we should keep it," he finally said, looking at the pup. "It isn't our pet. Maybe it's the key to reconciliation. Perhaps it escaped because it became the cause of discord? Or maybe it just got separated from its pack," I replied, clenching my hands in my lap. "We don't know the real cause of the conflict, but we saw that the tribes are divided, and now, what if it's their common child? Or what if they need to bring it back under their care?" We sat in silence for a long while, listening to the sounds in the forest, coming to the understanding that if we kept the young one, the conflict would only intensify. After all, even as humans, we were inadvertently becoming part of this ancient enmity. And what if returning the pup to its family was the only chance to end the bloody feud between these tribes? We didn't feel we had the right to interfere with the fate of entire tribes, yet we couldn't simply abandon the frightened little one that had found in us a source of warmth and safety. My inner voice insisted. Letting go meant giving it a chance to be saved. And maybe in doing so, saving everyone caught up in this massacre. The decision came to us amidst the raging clash of the night, as particularly loud cries reached our ears. I bundled up, pressed the pup close to my chest. Kyle grabbed a flashlight and after a brief, "Let's go," led me to the door. We stepped out into the cold night air and cautiously made our way through the yard. The moon cast a strange silver light over the forest. Somewhere at the edge of the property we noticed a tall, dark figure. My breath caught. An adult dogman emerged from the dense shadows and froze, staring at us. I felt a battle between paralyzing terror and a faint hope that he might understand us. His eyes blazed, and from his open maw came a guttural growl. Summoning every bit of courage, I slowly knelt down, releasing the pup from my arms. It whimpered plaintively, reluctant to move, but I whispered softly that everything would be all right. At last, the little one took a hesitant step forward. The adult creature growled a little softer, tilting his head. For a moment I thought he might lunge at us, but when the pup crept closer, the dogman cautiously sniffed it, inspected it, and suddenly lifted his snout toward the moon, emitting a long, resonant call. From afar, an answer came immediately. It was as if the entire forest had awakened, and the sounds of conflict paused for a heartbeat. It seemed that the appearance of the pup had distracted the tribes from their bitter quarrel. We watched as the dogman, whom we had addressed, took the pup gently in his arms and retreated deeper into the thicket. Then his silhouette merged with the darkness, and only the moonlight glided along the tree trunks. Suddenly, the cries ceased. It was as if the very presence of the young creature had made everyone realize the futility of the fight. We stood, holding our breath, listening as silence spread throughout the forest. Only the whisper of the wind remained constant. It took several minutes before we understood that the clash had ended. Somehow, our intervention, returning the pup, had altered the balance of power. We never knew exactly what transpired between the tribes. Perhaps they united over their common child, or at least agreed to a temporary truce. But one thing was clear. Nature and its inhabitants abide by laws that we humans cannot comprehend. We can only observe and, if lucky, not become the cause of further destruction. When we returned to the house, shivering whether from cold or shock, the interior looked unchanged, old furniture, wooden panels, and the flickering fire in the hearth. Yet we were not the same. A feeling of humility before the power of the forest remained within us. along with the realization that the monsters of legend are sometimes more real than we'd like to believe. The next morning, Kyle suggested that we leave. I looked longingly at the painfully familiar walls and the path along which I had once wandered as a child. But inside, a troubling understanding had taken root. Sometimes, nature does not wish for extra witnesses. And perhaps, after the night we had just endured, even more terrifying events were to follow. We might try to figure it all out, but that was beyond our strength. And so we did. We packed our things, shuttered the windows, locked the doors, and left, taking with us the fear, the awe, and gratitude toward those who perhaps deep within the forests and caves had shown us mercy. In return, we kept their secret. Now when I think back to those days, a strange feeling overwhelms me. I know that there, in the remote thickets of northwestern Washington, something happened. Perhaps one of the oldest tales of reconciliation or a new beginning for those who dwell in the half-light of myth. And maybe someday those mysterious dogmen will remind the world of their presence once again, when it is ready, or when the young pup, grown up in these woods, rises to lead its tribe and shows people that their legends are but a glimpse of a true, terrifying reality. Story 3. At the far end of my yard stood 2 kennels, positioned right on the edge of the property. Beyond them stretched a primeval forest, dense and gloomy, though by day it would be a perfect place to spend hours searching for berries or mushrooms. However, as evening approached, the twilight grew thicker, merging with the treetops and evoking a strange sense of unease. Here, at the boundary between civilization and the wild, lived my loyal dogs, an energetic Labrador, reminiscent of an eternal child, and a stately pit bull with a serious bearing. I had named the Labrador Max, a creature marked by an insatiable zest for life and an endless supply of energy. He could chase a ball for hours or race around the yard as if nothing else existed. The pit bull, whom I called Rock, was more reserved, though beneath his formidable exterior beat a sensitive heart. The moment I petted him, he would start wagging his short tail and let out soft whimpers. Despite their differing personalities, they got along perfectly, playing and frolicking together while the sun still bathed them in its cheerful light. 2 spacious kennels, built side by side, served as their reliable refuge at night. By day, I would let them run free in the yard and try to arrange at least a short walk along the forest's edge. Max enjoyed sniffing the fresh air, while Rock preferred to stroll calmly at his side, keeping an eye on his more exuberant companion. In the evenings, they would be fed and then rest, ready for new adventures in the morning. Lately, however, as the sun began to set, both dogs started to show signs of unease. It seemed as though they were anxiously glancing toward the dark wall of the forest, as if they sensed something I could not see. Twilight descended quickly, and at that time, Max would start barking while Rock joined in with a low growl. It was as if they were trying to warn me of an approaching danger. At first, I dismissed it as mere instinct. But with each passing evening, the sense of dread grew stronger. I had no inkling that this was the prelude to events that would upend my life. The following evening, I noticed that Max and Rock were even more agitated. Max wasn't just whining, he was scanning the darkness with his eyes, pressing himself against the kennel wall. Rock growled softly while staying close to the gate, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a wary alertness. Even when I appeared in the yard, they didn't rush toward me as they once did. Instead, they looked at me guiltily, as if afraid that I too might vanish into the night. I decided that perhaps they were simply craving more attention or longer walks. Yet, when I opened the gate to take them out for a short stroll, the dogs suddenly recoiled, refusing to leave the confines of their kennels. Max shrank back in fear and Rock tensed up, staring toward the forest. Out of habit, I peered into the depths of the trees, trying to make out any shape, but the dense darkness swallowed all contours. Determined to find out what was happening, I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the dogs to lead them out on their leashes. That was my first mistake. Passing the dim security light by the porch, I felt as if the night air had thickened around me, becoming heavy and viscous. Noises that I'd never noticed before now sounded so loud, as if the forest itself had come alive in the dark. Rock and Max, who usually greeted me with joyful yelps, were now silent. As I approached the kennels, I noticed that the pit bull had literally pressed himself into a corner, and Max whimpered plaintively. Their eyes seemed to look right through me, as though trying to warn me of something behind me. I felt a slight tingle at the tips of my fingers, as if a jolt of static electricity had passed through my body. The flashlight's weak beam illuminated only a small circle around us, leaving everything else to the dominion of a nightmarish darkness. It was then that I realized our peaceful existence was gone for good. Nightfall draped the yard in a thick shroud of darkness. Sitting on the porch, I tried to collect my thoughts when, suddenly, I heard a sharp crack coming from the direction of the forest. The sound was so loud that it reverberated in my chest. Max flinched and fell silent, staring in that direction. Rock, despite his usual courage, began to retreat timidly. It seemed that even one more such sound would set them off into a panicked flight. I got up and moved toward the kennels, deciding to fetch Max first. He was typically the more skittish one, and I wanted to comfort him. At the same time, I knew that Rock also needed attention. Though he appeared brave, his formidable exterior masked hidden fears. Leaving Rock too long might trigger an outburst of stress-induced aggression. I was torn with the painful realization that one of them would have to wait. Taking Max on his leash, I briskly led him back toward the house, all the while keeping an eye on Rock. Each step back felt agonizingly slow. The wind crept under my clothes, chilling my skin, and the unceasing crack from deep within the forest did not let up. Finally, I reached the second kennel to fetch Rock. The dog trembled all over, yet still tried to maintain an air of confidence, whining loudly and pressing his ears against his head. At that moment, a disgusting odor filled the air, a smell reminiscent of rotting meat. I had to cover my nose with my sleeve to avoid choking. The forest seemed to come alive. Between the trees, I heard rustlings and quick footsteps, and then there was the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, as if something enormous was striding right nearby. A surge of panic shot through me. I sensed a shadow stirring behind me. I knew I had to leave immediately, yet the footsteps behind grew ever closer. Before I could even turn around, I heard something like a long, inhuman wail, a sound that hammered into my ears and drilled its way into my brain. Max, sitting on the porch, barked as if gripped by a primordial terror. Rock by my side jerked, wrenching the leash from my grasp. Everything happened so fast, yet it felt as if time were in slow motion. My heart pounded in my temples, and my legs felt as if they had fused with the ground. Somewhere deep in the forest, something was moving. A blurred shadow slipping between the trees, emitting sounds I couldn't quite recognize. It didn't resemble any animal, and it certainly wasn't human. Another piercing wail tore through the silence, echoing through the yard, and I felt the ground shudder beneath my feet. In my terror, I called for Rock, but the dog had already bolted, unable to withstand the panic. A sense of being pursued weighed heavily on my mind. I dashed toward the porch in a desperate bid to reach Max, whose incessant barking grew louder by the second. Yet every step felt excruciatingly long, time stretched out, and the surrounding silence was broken only by the eerie sounds from the forest. Overwhelmed by fear, I felt my strength draining away. I no longer sensed the cold, only an intense, burning desire to escape this nightmare. At some point, I caught sight of Rock, who had dashed out of the darkness toward me, and together we ran back to the house. From the forest came groans and a strange crunch, as if thick branches were being snapped. My vision blurred. I could barely make out the outline of the porch. When we finally reached the front door, I practically collapsed inside. Dragging the dogs along, at that very moment a final cry echoed, a wild farewell roar, and then everything fell silent. After that night, I could no longer look at the forest's edge without trembling. Daylight became my sole oasis of calm. Under the sun's rays, everything seemed normal again. I tried to convince myself it had all been just a nightmarish hallucination, a trick of my imagination. Yet the skittish behavior of Max and Rock testified that they had not forgotten the horror they had witnessed. The mere approach of dusk would once again fill them with dread. I resolved to change our routine drastically. No more nighttime walks, and certainly no lingering in the yard after sunset. Every evening I locked the doors and windows, keeping the dogs close, inside the house or on short leashes. As soon as the sky began to darken, I turned on every light I had, as if hoping that the lamps could repel the darkness and the dreadful creatures that might be lurking among the trees. Sleeping became nearly impossible. Every indistinct rustle outside made my heart race uncontrollably. My imagination painted terrifying images. A shadow creeping toward the house, or eyes staring in through a window from the impenetrable night. I developed the habit of checking all the doors and windows several times each evening. A cup of coffee and the glow of the television became my nightly companions. Though they could not dispel the feeling that I was no longer safe even in my own home. More and more, my thoughts turned to self-defense. The idea of purchasing a weapon ceased to seem like an extreme measure. I felt besieged. Max and Rock, though still vigilant, now appeared even more confused. It was as if the fear of the encroaching darkness had taken permanent residence in their hearts. Reflecting on that night, I realized we had been only a hair's breadth from destruction. And what if whatever roams in the forest were to return? Weeks passed, yet the sense of unease never left me for even a moment. Every sunset revived memories of that horrible wail and the stench of decay. I could no longer enjoy the quiet evenings that had once been my solace. Constantly checking locks and windows became a ritual that left my hands trembling. Max and Rock, too, had changed. They seemed to have lost faith in my ability to protect them. Sometimes I caught myself thinking I was losing my mind. Perhaps nothing had happened at all, and we had merely become victims of a collective illusion. But the memory of that unnatural shadow, the heavy breathing that almost brushed my skin, and the repulsive stench of decaying flesh shattered all logic into dust. A deep-seated fear took root in my soul, the fear that this creature was still wandering the forest, waiting for me to let my guard down. I began researching ways to secure the house, from simple traps to the possibility of acquiring a weapon. Thoughts of what might happen again haunted me. Despite all the precautions I took, an eerie emptiness remained within me. After all, what if no door, no wall, could keep out true evil? Max and Rock still flinched at every nocturnal sound, responding with anxious growls at the slightest rustle. The kennels at the edge of the yard were left empty. I no longer dared leave the dogs there overnight. Yet even locked doors inside the house failed to provide any real sense of security. As evening approached, I found myself repeatedly recalling those events, wondering if the coming night might bring another encounter with the unknown horror. The silence outside the window grew louder than any sound, and the darkness deepened, carrying away the remnants of my confidence. Perhaps that terror would return, and then we would have to face it head on.